"Your little hobby is dead," Dad said, signing the deed before I could touch it. My brother smirked. Mom kept eating. In less than 10 seconds, they had reassigned my lab, my team, and everything they assumed I had built for them. Then my phone buzzed against the table. I looked down. AI, core patent secured. Bidding starts at 5.2 billion. Dad noticed my face change. What he snapped. I slowly turned the signed deed back toward him. He thought that signature had just ended my career. What he didn't know was that it had confirmed something his lawyers had warned him about weeks ago. To understand why that signature mattered, you have to understand my family. I'm Phoebe Mercer. I'm 36, an AI systems architect, and I've spent most of my adult life solving problems nobody notices until something breaks. I've never looked like the person my father thought should run a technology division. I keep my chestnut hair tied low, wear little makeup, and would rather spend 12 hours beside humming servers than 40 minutes at a networking dinner. My coffee is usually cold before I remember it exists. My younger brother, Nolan, is the opposite. At 33, Nolan can walk into a room full of strangers and have half of them laughing before the appetizers arrive. He's handsome, polished, and genuinely talented at business development. He remembers names, closes deals, and knows exactly when to shake a hand or lower his voice. Dad loved that. Grant Mercer built his career in logistics and industrial technology. He understood investors, leverage, and power. What he never understood was why anyone cared who actually built the thing being sold. In Dad's world, Nolan looked like leadership. I looked like support. Mom, Evelyn, made that arrangement feel almost loving. Phoebe can handle it. She'd say whenever Nolan needed something, "She's always been the strong one." It sounds like praise until you realize strong means everyone is allowed to put more weight on you. That pattern started early. When I was 13, my grandmother gave me a small red toolbox. I used it to take apart an old kitchen radio that had stopped working. I spent an entire Saturday on the floor, surrounded by screws and wires, until music finally crackled through the speaker again. Grandma smiled like I'd built a rocket. "My little inventor," she said. Dad glanced over his newspaper, another little hobby everyone laughed. I did too, for years. I kept that toolbox, and Dad kept that phrase. Any project he didn't understand was a hobby. Any experiment that didn't immediately produce revenue was a hobby. Nearly 3 years before that Sunday dinner, I started my biggest one. I was building a new AI core designed to analyze massive logistics networks in real time, spotting bottlenecks and adjusting thousands of variables before small disruptions became expensive disasters. And this time, I was careful. I developed it outside working hours. I used my own equipment, paid for separate computing resources, kept detailed research records, and formally disclosed the project so ownership could never be confused later. The company was allowed to evaluate a limited demonstration version, nothing more. Dad barely looked at it. Nolan did. I still remember the expression on his face when he watched the system solve in seconds a routing problem his team had struggled with for days. He didn't ask how I built it. He asked one question: how soon can we show this to clients? That was the moment Dad's little hobby stopped being invisible, and the moment my brother began talking about it as if it were his. At first, Nolan was careful. He would stand in front of clients and say, "We're exploring a new system." Then it became, "My team has been developing something." A few weeks later, I heard him say, "My AI strategy could completely change how we handle disruptions." My AI strategy. I was standing 10 feet away when he said it. I looked at Dad, waiting for him to correct the record. He didn't. After the meeting, I followed him into the hallway. "Dad, he didn't build it." Grant barely slowed down. "He knows how to sell it. You know how to build it. Stop making everything about credit." That sentence stayed with me because it sounded reasonable for about 5 seconds. Then, the trade magazines started calling Nolan a rising technology visionary. My name appeared once, near the bottom, under technical support. I told myself it didn't matter. Then Dr. Lena Ward came in. She was part of an outside evaluation team, reviewing whether our demonstration system was mature enough for a larger commercial partnership. Nolan ran the presentation. And to be fair, he was good. He moved through the slides smoothly, joked with the executives, and made complicated ideas sound simple. Then, Lena closed the presentation packet in front of her. If 3 major data streams conflict during the same disruption, she asked, how does the core decide which information to trust without creating a cascade failure? Nolan smiled. That's where our adaptive intelligence framework becomes incredibly dynamic. Lena didn't smile back. That isn't what I asked. The room changed. Nolan glanced at Dad, then at me. I knew that look. I had seen it my whole life. Fix this. So I did. I explained how the core ranked source reliability, isolated corrupted inputs, and recalculated decisions without allowing one bad stream to contaminate the entire network. Lena leaned forward. Then she asked another question. I answered, then another. By the 4th question, Nolan wasn't presenting anymore. He was listening. For one stupid moment, I felt hopeful. I thought Dad had finally watched enough to understand. After the evaluators left, he shut the conference room door. What was that? I blinked. I answered her questions. You made Nolan look completely unprepared. He was unprepared. Dad's jaw tightened. Your job is not to prove you're smarter than your brother. I stared at him. Then what exactly is my job? He stepped closer and lowered his voice. To make sure he never looks like he doesn't know what he's doing. Something inside me went very quiet. 3 days later, I saw the restructuring plan. Nolan was being given control of the innovation division, my lab, the company hardware, the legacy systems, my engineering staff. Legal had already prepared the deed. Then I noticed one line in the attached asset schedule. The AI core was listed separately, independently owned technology, limited evaluation license, excluded from transfer. Dad had never noticed it. That evening, Mom called me. Sunday dinner, she said softly. Please don't make this difficult. She didn't ask how I felt. She didn't have to. They had already decided what belonged to Nolan. For the first time in my life, I stopped thinking about how to protect my family from the consequences. I started thinking about how to protect myself. That night, I went home and didn't turn on the lights. Rain tapped against the apartment windows. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Somewhere below, a car horn sounded and disappeared into the city. I stood in front of the shelf beside my desk and looked at the little red toolbox my grandmother had given me when I was 13. The paint was chipped now. One corner was dented. I opened it anyway. Inside were a few old screwdrivers, a pair of pliers, and the tiny wrench I had used on that broken radio all those years ago. I sat down on the floor, and for the first time, I let myself admit something I had spent years avoiding. I wasn't fighting for credit, not really. I was fighting for proof that my family loved me for more than what I could fix. Every time Nolan failed, I stepped in. Every time Dad needed a technical problem solved, I stayed late. Every time Mom said, "You're stronger," I swallowed whatever I felt and carried a little more. Being useful had become the closest thing I knew to being valued, and that realization hurt more than losing the lab. I picked up the old screwdriver and remembered Grandma sitting beside me on the kitchen floor. She never asked what my work could earn. She asked one thing, "What did you make?" I started crying then. Quietly. Not because I was afraid of losing the company, because I finally understood how long I had been begging the wrong people to see me. The next morning, I called an independent intellectual property attorney, not to attack my family, to make sure I knew exactly where I stood. Over the next several days, we reviewed everything: my research notes, my personal computing bills, payments for private development resources, the timeline showing when the core had been built, the invention disclosure I had filed, the limited evaluation agreement the company had accepted. Nothing had been hidden. Nothing had been taken from company systems. The conclusion was simple. The company owned its legacy software. I owned the AI core. My attorney looked across the table at me. "They can pressure you," she said. "They can threaten your job, but they cannot transfer property they do not own." For the first time all week, I could breathe. There was one more piece. For months, Several qualified buyers and licensing partners had been waiting for the final patent decision before entering a formal competitive process. The opening qualified bid had already been set, $5.2 billion, but the patent confirmation still hadn't arrived, and Sunday was getting closer. I made myself one promise before I left that office. I would not delete anything. I would not damage anything. I would not leak private information or punish innocent employees. I would simply stop giving my family what they had never earned the right to take. Sunday evening, I drove to the penthouse. The red toolbox sat in my trunk. When I entered the dining room, the deed was already beside my plate. Dad had even marked where he wanted me to sign. Sunday dinner started exactly the way it always did. Soft jazz drifted from the ceiling speakers. Mom had roasted vegetables beside the salmon, and Nolan was talking about how he wanted to redesign the innovation floor once the transfer was complete. Not if. Once. I sat there listening while he described glass walls, a larger conference room, and a private office near the lab I had built. Then Dad placed his fork down. He reached beside his chair, pulled out the deed, and slid it toward me. "Your little hobby is dead," he said. 4 words, the same 4 words he had used when I was 13, only this time. Nobody laughed. "Nolan takes control of the division tomorrow," Dad continued. "The lab, the hardware, the legacy systems, the staff. You can stay on as senior technical support if you cooperate." I looked at Nolan. He gave me what I think he believed was a sympathetic smile. "I'll make sure you still get proper technical credit." I almost laughed. Instead, I looked back at Dad. "And if I don't sign," his expression hardened, "then your employment ends tonight." Mom finally looked up. "Phoebe, please, don't turn this into some dramatic family crisis." I stared at her. Apparently, losing 3 years of my work was drama. Taking it was business. I pushed the deed back. "I'm not signing." Dad's face changed. Not much, just enough. His jaw tightened, and he reached for his pen. "Fine. I don't need your permission to transfer company property." He signed the executive section himself, slowly, confidently. The scratch of the pen across the paper sounded strangely loud. Nolan leaned back in his chair. Mom exhaled. Dad capped the pen and looked at me. "There. Done." My phone buzzed beside my plate. Once, I looked down. A message filled the screen. AI. Core patent secured. Bidding starts at $5.2 billion. For a second, everything around me disappeared. The music, the silverware. Nolan's satisfied expression. I read the message again. Then I smiled. Dad noticed immediately. What I turned the deed toward him. About that signature. His eyes narrowed. "What about it?" Nolan leaned forward. I tapped the attached asset schedule, opened the exclusions. Dad didn't move. "What are you talking about?" "The schedule your own legal team attached to the deed you just signed." His irritation returned. He grabbed the papers and flipped through them. Nolan stood and moved closer. Mom stopped eating. Dad reached the final pages. His eyes moved down the list, then stopped. I watched the exact moment his confidence cracked. Nolan noticed too. What Dad said nothing. I pointed to the line. The AI. Core was listed as independently owned technology under a limited evaluation license, excluded from transfer. Nolan looked at me. "That has to be wrong." "It isn't." Dad shoved the paper flat against the table. "Legal made a mistake." "No." "Dad. Legal used the invention disclosure I filed almost 3 years ago. The same disclosure the company accepted before anyone knew what the core might be worth." His face had gone pale. "You worked here when you built it. I worked here while I built it somewhere else. On my own time. With my own equipment, my own computing resources, my own money." I tapped the deed. "You just signed a document confirming exactly what the company owns." I looked at Nolan, the lab, then Dad, the hardware, back to Nolan, the legacy systems. I let the silence stretch. "You gave Nolan everything that was yours." Dad stared at me. "But you never owned mine." Nolan pushed his chair back. "This is ridiculous. That system was built for this family." I looked at him, then answered one question. His eyes shifted. if the primary optimization layer rejects two high-confidence inputs at the same time? What prevents the fallback model from reinforcing the same conflict? Nolan opened his mouth. Nothing came out. It was not the hardest question I could have asked. That was the point. Months earlier, I would have rescued him, this time. I let the silence answer for me. Dad finally looked at my phone. 5.2 billion. That's where the qualified bidding starts. Something changed in the room. Nolan's anger vanished first. Who's bidding? I almost couldn't believe it. 10 minutes earlier, my work had been a hobby. Now he wanted the buyer list. Dad leaned forward. We paid for your education. We gave you a career. Everything you have started with this family. There it was. The old weight. Guilt dressed up as love. For years. Those words would have worked. That night, they didn't. I'll transfer every piece of company-owned work properly, I said. I'll document everything. I won't hurt the staff. I won't interfere with operations. Mom's shoulders relaxed slightly. Then I finished, but the core stays with me. Dad's fist tightened around the pen. You're walking away from your family over money. No. I stood. The money is just the first thing that ever made you look at my work and see value. Nobody answered. I picked up my coat. Mom said my name. Nolan said we could negotiate. Dad ordered me to sit down. Guilt, bargaining, authority. The same three doors they had always used to keep me in the room. I opened a fourth. I left, down in the garage. I opened my trunk. Grandma's red toolbox sat exactly where I had left it. I rested my hand on the chipped lid. For the first time. Walking away didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like breathing. Then my phone buzzed again. No new bid, no bigger number. Just one message from outside counsel. Emergency board meeting, 8 o'clock the next morning. Dad had lost control of me. Tomorrow, he would have to explain why to people who didn't call me his daughter. They called me the owner. At 8 the next morning, I walked into the boardroom carrying one laptop and no apology. Dad was already there. So was Nolan. Outside counsel sat near the far end with two independent advisors. Nobody touched the coffee. The review took less than an hour. They looked at the research timeline, the invention disclosure, my personal payments, the computing bills, the evaluation license, and the patent ownership records. No trick. No hidden clause, no technicality. Just a very uncomfortable fact. The AI core belonged to me. The company owned its legacy systems. It owned the lab equipment. It owned the work created under company assignments. But it did not own the core. Dad kept interrupting until one board member finally raised a hand. Grant, stop. The room went silent. I had never heard anyone speak to my father that way. Then came the harder part. The board reviewed months of presentations in which Nolan had been positioned as the strategic mind behind technology he could not independently explain. They reviewed the restructuring plan. They reviewed the decision to build a succession strategy around intellectual property the company did not control. Nobody accused Nolan of a crime. They didn't need to. By noon, he had been removed from leadership of the technology program. He stared at the table when they told him. For once. There was nobody beside him translating failure into opportunity. Dad fought longer. He called the decision short-sighted. He called me disloyal. He reminded everyone how much of the company he had built. But that was exactly the problem. He had spent so many years believing the company was an extension of himself that he stopped recognizing where his authority ended. The board voted to remove him from executive control, pending a full governance restructuring. Dad didn't lose everything that morning. He lost the thing he valued most, the right to decide what happened next. A few weeks later, the bidding process around my patent portfolio officially moved forward from the $5.2 billion opening level. I could have chased the biggest check and never looked back. I didn't. I chose a structured licensing path that protected my ownership while allowing qualified partners, including my former employer, to use parts of the technology under clear terms. No family favors, no vague promises, no one taking credit because their last name matched mine. If the company wanted access, it would license the core like anyone else. The new agreement required independent technical leadership, clear inventor attribution, transparent ownership, and no business executive overriding engineering decisions they didn't understand. That mattered more to me than humiliating Dad. 1 year later, I stood in a quieter research space surrounded by people whose names appeared beside the work they actually created. Grandma's red toolbox sat on a shelf near my desk. Next to it was a framed copy of the patent. Not the bidding number. Not a magazine cover. The patent. Nolan had taken a smaller business development job elsewhere. He was finally being judged on what he could actually do. Dad still lived in Chicago. We spoke occasionally, carefully. He was still my father. He just wasn't my authority anymore. And that difference changed everything. Family can love you and still believe they're entitled to pieces of you they never earned. I learned that setting a boundary isn't cruelty. Sometimes it's the first honest thing you do for yourself. I didn't win when the bidding opened at $5.2 billion. I won the night I said no without needing my father to understand why. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting what was yours, tell me what you would have done. Share this story. And subscribe for the next one.